Pain was never the enemy to the ancient warrior. It was the teacher. Long before comfort became a virtue, before distraction was sold as peace, the samurai learned something we quietly forgot. Pain is not an interruption of the path. It is the path. It sharpens presence. It exposes ego. It strips illusion until only what is real remains. A young warrior once asked his master why the training never softened, even as skill increased. The master did not answer with words. He handed the student a blade dulled by years of use and said, "Strike until you feel nothing. Then continue until you feel everything." Modern minds run from discomfort. We numb it, label it trauma, or drown it in noise. But the ancient system understood something psychology is only now rediscovering. Pain, when faced in silence, reorganizes the spirit. It forges discipline. It builds strength without arrogance. It teaches fear how to kneel. This is not a story about suffering for its own sake. It is about mastery, about how pain becomes a gateway, not to cruelty, but to clarity. Tonight, we walk an older path, one where presence is earned, not declared. One where silence trains the warrior more than words ever could. One where pain is not resisted, but listened to. If this lesson echoes in your heart, stay and walk the path with us. The first cut. When pain enters the path, the first cut never comes during battle. It comes during belief. The young warrior believed strength meant protection, that discipline would shield him from pain, that mastery would one day make suffering unnecessary. That illusion shattered the moment steel bit skin during a training ritual no one explained beforehand. No ceremony, no warning. Just a blade, dull but unforgiving, pressed into the forearm until blood traced a thin red thread down to the dust. He looked to the mentor, waiting for permission to stop. None came. Pain surged, not only in the flesh, but in the mind. Fear rose fast. Fear of weakness, fear of being seen, fear of discovering that he was less than he imagined. The ego screamed for escape. Every instinct demanded withdrawal. But the mentor finally spoke softly. Pain is not punishment, it is information. The body reacts. The nervous system records. The spirit listens. Modern science would later name this moment learning under stress, but the ancient system already knew. Avoidance teaches the wrong lesson. The warrior stayed. And something inside him cracked, not bone, but belief. Transition. What breaks first is never the body. It is the story you told yourself about who you are. That night, the wound burned long after the bleeding stopped. Sleep came in fragments. Each pulse of pain reopened the moment. The silence, the blade, the absence of mercy. He replayed it again and again, searching for meaning, for justification, for comfort. There was none. Only sensation, only memory. By dawn, something subtle had changed. The pain was still there, but it no longer shouted. It waited. And in that waiting, the warrior noticed something unsettling. The body adapts faster than the mind. The nervous system calms when resistance fades. Modern science would call this exposure. The ancients called it truth. The mentor returned at sunrise, said nothing, and handed him a cloth, not to cover the wound, but to clean it himself. Responsibility replaced resentment. Pain became a message he had to decode alone. This was the first lesson the path never announces. Suffering loses power the moment you stop asking it to leave. Transition. Once pain is no longer the enemy, fear begins to reveal where it truly lives. Silence as the anvil. The next phase of training did not begin with instruction. It began with disappearance. The mentor stopped correcting, stopped explaining. Some days, he did not appear at all. The dojo felt hollow, as if something essential had been removed. The warrior waited for words that never came, for reassurance that never arrived. Silence thickened the air. It pressed against the chest harder than any blade. Tasks were assigned without comment. Stances held until legs shook. Breathing slowed until the mind panicked. Pain grew sharper because there was no narrative to soften it. No voice to say this is progress. The ego hated this most, the absence of witness. Modern science would later confirm what the ancient system already practiced. Without constant feedback, the nervous system is forced inward. Awareness sharpens, sensation becomes louder, thought loses dominance. In the quiet, the warrior noticed something unsettling. The mind creates noise to escape feeling. When silence removes that exit, discomfort reveals its true shape, and it was larger than expected. Transition. When words fall away, fear finds nowhere left to hide. Days turned into a strange, unmeasured stretch of time. Without instruction, the warrior began to hear what he had always drowned out: the tremor in his breath, the subtle ache beneath the muscles, the quiet surge of fear when nothing distracted him from it. Silence did not calm him at first. It exposed him. At night, he sat alone, facing a wooden drawer sealed with a thin red thread, a ritual object no one was permitted to open. The elders said nothing about it. Curiosity burned hotter than pain. He learned to sit with that urge too, to let wanting rise and fall without action. Neuroscience would one day call this impulse inhibition. The ancients called it discipline. Slowly, the body adapted again. Heart rate steadied. Pain dulled not because it vanished, but because it was no longer resisted. The silence stopped feeling empty. It became weight-bearing, like iron. The mentor finally returned weeks later and asked only one question: what spoke when I was gone? The warrior had no answer, and for the first time, that felt like progress. Transition. When silence becomes strength, fear begins to recognize you by name. Fear learns your name. Fear did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like a whisper you couldn't turn off. The mentor led the warrior beyond the dojo, into a grove where stone markers stood crooked in the moss. No one spoke of this place. No one trained here. At the edge, a cracked cross leaned against an old cedar, a foreign symbol in an ancient land, as if someone tried to bury a different kind of shame. The warrior felt his chest tighten before he understood why. The mentor tied a thin red thread around the warrior's wrist, then pointed to a narrow bridge over black water. "Walk," he said. Nothing more. Halfway across, the boards groaned. The warrior froze. Not because the bridge would break, but because his mind began to paint a future where it did. Fear always does that. It creates a story, then convinces the body it's real. Modern psychology calls it threat simulation. The ancient system called it illusion. Fear did not ask permission. It said his name. Transition. The moment you stop moving is the moment fear starts writing your life for you. The mentor did not rescue him, did not shout encouragement. Silence again. The boards creaked. Water moved beneath. The warrior's breath shortened, muscles locked, vision narrowed, the body preparing for a danger that had not yet arrived. Fear had moved from thought into flesh. Then something subtle shifted. He noticed where fear lived. Not in the bridge, not in the water, but in the chest, in the jaw, in the hands gripping too tightly. Pain sharpened those signals. It pointed directly to the hiding place. The mentor's voice finally reached him, calm and precise. Fear grows when you argue with it. Watch it. So he did. He watched the tremor. He watched the urge to flee. He did nothing else. Heart rate slowed. Breath lengthened. Neuroscience would later describe this as parasympathetic regulation. The ancients simply called it staying. He took one step, then another. Fear shrank each time it was not obeyed. On the other side, the mentor cut the red thread without ceremony. Now it knows you won't listen. The warrior felt no triumph, only presence, and something colder followed behind it. Transition. When fear loses its voice, the ego begins to panic. The death of ego through repetition. Repetition arrived without warning and without end. The warrior was given a single movement, One step, one cut, one breath, and told to repeat it until nightfall. No variation, no progression. The same action again and again, until the mind began to revolt. Muscles burned, yes, but that was familiar. What shocked him was the deeper irritation, the quiet rage of the ego realizing it would not be entertained. By the 100th repetition, pride started asking questions. Why this? What is this proving? By the 1000th, identity itself began to blur. There was no audience, no record, no praise. The effort disappeared into the air like breath on a cold morning. Ancient systems understood something brutal and precise. Novelty feeds the ego. Monotony starves it. Modern neuroscience would later observe the same phenomenon. The default mode network quiets when the self is no longer centered. Pain stayed, meaning dissolved. And in that emptiness, something fragile inside him began to crack. Transition. When the ego loses its voice, the mind searches desperately for a place to stand. By the 3rd day, time itself seemed damaged. Hours collapsed into sensation. The warrior could no longer mark progress or failure, only movement. Somewhere nearby, a burned ledger lay sealed beneath stone, its pages rumored to hold the names of those who quit. No one confirmed it. No one denied it either. Curiosity lingered like a threat. The body learned without celebration. The cut sharpened, the stance deepened, but the warrior did not feel stronger. He felt smaller, not diminished, but stripped. Ego depends on comparison. Repetition removes witnesses. Without reflection, arrogance starves. Psychology would later call this de-identification, the loosening of attachment to self-image. The ancients called it preparation. On the final repetition, the mentor appeared and said only, "Now you are ready to be bad at this forever." There was no anger, no relief, only a quiet acceptance that mastery had nothing to do with arrival. As the warrior turned away, he noticed something unsettling. Repetition had not killed the ego completely. It had taught it how to hide. Transition. When ego retreats into silence, strength begins to take a darker, quieter shape. Strength without noise. Strength no longer arrived with tension. It arrived with stillness. The warrior moved differently now, slower but never late. His steps carried weight without force, like stones settling into earth. Pain still visited the body, but it no longer demanded reaction. The flinch was gone. The urge to prove anything had faded with it. Others began to notice before he did. Conversations quieted when he entered a room, not from fear, from recalibration. The space adjusted itself around him. This was not dominance. It was gravity. The mentor watched in silence, then finally spoke. Modern strength performs. Ancient strength stabilizes. Pain had trained restraint. Silence had trained control. Neuroscience would call it efficient regulation, less energy, more output. The ancient system called it readiness. The warrior understood something unsettling then. True mastery is not loud because it does not need confirmation. It does not ask to be seen. And because of that, it is often misunderstood. Transition. When strength stops speaking, the world begins to listen differently. There were moments when this new quiet felt almost dangerous. Without anger, without visible effort, the warrior could now end conflict before it began. A single glance settled disputes. A pause dissolved tension. He did not raise his voice because there was no need. His presence had already spoken. The mentor warned him of this phase. "Power without noise invites projection," he said. "People will mistake your calm for judgment, your restraint for coldness." The warrior saw it immediately. Some grew uneasy. Others grew curious. A few resented him. Strength that cannot be provoked threatens those who rely on chaos. Modern psychology explains this unease. Regulated nervous systems disrupt dysregulated ones. Calm exposes instability without accusation. The ancient system understood the cost. Mastery isolates before it liberates. One evening, the warrior noticed a burned symbol carved into the training hall's beam, an old mark used only once before, when a disciple surpassed the need for correction. No one spoke of what followed after that mark appeared. The warrior did not ask. He only stood longer in the silence, aware that the path was narrowing, and that something ahead would demand not strength, but surrender. Transition. When power no longer needs expression, the final test is whether you can walk without being followed. Walking the path without needing witness. The mentor did not announce his leaving. One morning, he was simply gone. No farewell, no final instruction. Only the quiet weight of absence, heavier than any presence had ever been. The warrior searched the grounds, the grove, the hall where the burned mark still slept in the wood. Nothing. Even the red thread drawer was gone, as if it had never existed. At first, a familiar ache surfaced. Not fear, not pain. Something more subtle, the reflex to be seen while continuing. Psychology would call this residual dependency. The ancient system had another word for it: the final attachment. Pain still visited the body in training. Muscles still failed, breath still tightened. But without the mentor's gaze, something changed. There was no one to impress, no one to disappoint. Discipline no longer needed permission to exist. That was when the warrior understood the cruelty of the design. The mentor had not abandoned him. He had removed the last mirror, and without reflection, the warrior had to decide who continued walking and why. Transition. When the witness disappears, the path reveals whether you were training for mastery or for approval. Days passed, then weeks. The world beyond the training grounds felt louder than before, not because it had changed, but because the warrior had. He moved through villages and valleys where people argued, rushed, demanded to be noticed. He felt the old pull to intervene, to correct, to be recognized. He did nothing. Pain still arrived in quieter forms now: fatigue, loneliness, the strange grief of outgrowing old selves. But suffering no longer multiplied it. Neuroscience would say the brain had learned regulation through exposure and restraint. The ancients would say the spirit had stopped negotiating with reality. One evening, the warrior found an old stone marker at the edge of a forgotten path. No name, no date, only a faint symbol carved deep, the same burned mark from the hall. No one ever spoke of those who reached this point, not because they vanished, but because they no longer needed to be remembered. The warrior sat beside it until night fell. He did not feel complete. He felt aligned. As he stood to leave, a thought surfaced, uninvited, unsettling. If the mentor was never meant to stay, how many voices in your own life are you still mistaking for guides? And once they fall silent, will you still know how to walk?